my practice, basically beginning with the kind of developing specificity, new form and spatial constellations against the kind of quantitative, repetitive, and monotonous and generic. So in the same way that, let's say in Rome, like these kind of centuries and millennia of layering of shapes basically has contributed to this cacophony, but also really intriguing urban texture. Yeah? How can we find means to create a kind of richness and the kind of complexity from a series of processes of design that has that kind of complexity? Now, modernism, obviously, the intriguing thing about it, by doing this kind of simplification, let's say, making everything orthogonal, so to say, it was able to integrate all the different scales into each other. So it becomes this kind of fractal, totally integrated system that is also like universal and infinite in a way. So that for me is extremely fascinating, but at the same time that was a kind of something to also critically engage with. I mean, I like the kind of the egalitarian spirit, yeah, of like this housing estate by Mies. Everybody basically has the same space. Everybody has that same view in a way. Yeah? So that there's something that we need to kind of rescue, I would say. Like what's happening right now with the parametricism or kind of iconic architecture. Every building wants to be just something different. Everybody's screaming, and nobody really thinks about what is appropriate and what is actually required, and how can we actually create a more egalitarian society. So these guys like Ludwig Hilversheim and Mies, they were obviously onto something, but then it's also something that currently within a pluralist society is something quite kind of a tough thing to swallow, right? To think that we are all fitting into this kind of matrix of sameness. When you look at Walter Costalla I think in the 1920s, 30s, he was actually looking at differentiation already. Yeah? So he was looking at how territory becomes organically through growth and through kind of trade relationships. Because organically you get these kind of different hierarchies of centers forming, and that's a really intriguing model, yeah, where you can actually get this kind of fractal differentiation from within and certain kind of focuses and internal relationships. And when I was living in Beijing for some years, and when you really walk through the center of Beijing, although it's orthogonal, you get this kind of internal organization of these kind of multiplicities of different centers and relationships embedded. Another important figure for me, it's Christopher Alexander, where he identifies this kind of nestedness in a different way, right? Where the complexity of a healthy spatial relationship is that it's its multiplicity. So you don't have just these kind of singular hierarchies, but you also get kind of like connections across these different planes of reality. And that's something that is very essential to kind of like moving forward from modernism and finding something that is working for our pluralist society. Then at the same time you have, this is obviously what he's criticizing, but in some ways when you're looking at flows, when you're looking at kind of accumulation of certain kind of quantities, yeah, then you get these patterns, and you should accommodate them. So this is a study that I have been doing with the students when we're looking at the kind of territorial quantities, let's say, or the kind of tessellation of areas, and then you're looking at the kind of the flow of goods and material and the flow of in this kind of agrarian context, and how all those produce that each of these little plots are delivering, where they're collected and where they're being transported. Then it's a kind of a completely different way of looking at the area and at the space. I'm just talking a few kind of fundamental experiences that I had myself personally. Like when I was a student again, I went for a study trip to this marble quarry in Carrara, And I think that's a really essential kind of experience of like understanding how something like landscape or ground is being transformed through these kind of Cartesian processes into kind of the production of material into certain kind of scales and sizes that then becomes actually something like this, for instance, yeah, in another place. So it's kind of like a very kind of simple but very intriguing kind of transformational process, really. Then a year later, I went on another study trip with my university to Southeast Asia, and here I discovered this kind of temple. But before discovering this temple, I was driving through the kind of in Indonesia through these really gridded forests, yeah. And this is the only picture that I found. My own pictures, I need to dig them out from somewhere. They're still on a kind of 35 millimeters. One day I will kind of take them out. But this is basically the experience of moving very fast, passing by this kind of grid of elements was a very profound one. Yeah, it's a kind of a very, very different reading. So here you can see, I just did this in Rhino quickly to compare a random kind of forest with the gridded one. Is a very, very different thing. So this temple then came to my attention because of this preoccupation. I saw this in Bangkok, and this is actually the floor plan. It's this kind of field of columns, and the fact that each column is also the same size as the negative space. So you don't have this kind of diagonal view through. That's why it does not feel like the forest. Because if every column would be just a little bit further away from each other, there would be more gap, then you could actually see through. They would actually appear as columns. And this way, it appears as a series of corridors. But still, it is this kind of field condition that, unfortunately, when you're there, it's not quite the same, but still intriguing. And then I did this experiment for myself to kind of like, if I moved these things a little bit out or made them smaller, I decreased the size, then you get these kind of like layers of transparency. And you get this kind of a spatial determination that is loose, that is actually non-fixed. It's actually visually depending on the view, on the place where you are. So it's a kind of another kind of spatial enclosure, I would say. So, and then this is another one of my personal preoccupations. When many times I went to the Cultural Forum in Berlin, and I can never really decide which building I like better, right? So I think many people feel like this, and some they just know, yeah? I hate this one, or I love that one, or vice versa. Now, when you start analyzing these kind of buildings and you look at how they actually relate to ground and how do they relate to the city, it's actually very clear that they're fulfilling very, very different roles. Yeah? So the modernist kind of universal space of Mies, it's really kind of extending itself into the city, and whilst Sharon is obviously as a kind of a concert hall is really inward focused. This is central space. So there's a reason for both configurations, and you could not easily flip them over. But then this was one of the early studies that we did in 2003, and this became actually later on the kind of Xi'an World Horticultural Fair. And here our preoccupation with kind of like looking at ground and looking at a kind of structured organizational grid, and then introducing deformation into it and creating local specificities, a network that is about the multiple, but is also unique in every instance. So that was what became a driving force for the practice of the studio later on, very much. So for me, form, this is just a very simple diagram, right? It's obviously this kind of causal relationship of like problem demands, moving and determining the function and the performance through the form itself. But my emphasis is on affect, on the activation and on the expansion of the mind of the users. That is as important, and that is also done through the form itself and through that act of translation and or formation. So the kind of phenomenological diagram that the architecture, if you can call it architecture, if it causes some realization or some consciousness, and not everything does, right? Most things we're just kind of seeing them in a daily routine kind of normative way, and they don't really come to our consciousness at all. So that's why architecture needs to kind of rise up from that kind of level of non-conscious, I believe. And then if that happens, then it does communicate between the past, so it's our memories, yeah, our what we know, yeah, so, and what we want to achieve, or why we're actually interested, why we're paying attention, what we want to get out of it. It's communicating the local with the global, and the individual with the society at every single instance. Yeah? So it's, can be quite powerful, yeah. But then at the same time, the way that the brain, when you look at the way that the brain is being simulated right now through neuronal intelligent AI, then it's actually about these multiplicities of connections between neurons, yeah. So that you can actually have a kind of a fuzzy logic. So this can be going here, but can also go there, and there's different probabilities. I think that's what Vera was talking about a little bit as well, about the kind of, what's the term, Zufall? And this is actually the translation. I will go later into this a bit more. It's our project for Xi'an Expo, where we did an urbanism, or like a park, where you had, in many different places, you have multiple choices, so that the whole thing becomes this gradient field of distribution. So it's kind of moving along. There is a directionality, there's a computation, right? But it's really giving a lot of freedom to the individual, and it's a completely radically new way of organizing space. I want to talk a little bit about the student work. In this case, this is where it started at the AA in 2003, where we were looking at landslide in Venezuela and slum areas, and the way that this student was intervening in these very steep hillsides. He was actually introducing opportunities for local delivery trucks and rubbish collection and so on to actually pass into areas where that wasn't possible. So previously there was a kind of a clear hierarchy about of proximity, yeah? And this is what's happening everywhere in cities. The proximity determines value, yeah? And if we as architects have the kind of responsibility to try and cut through that and to kind of create more new opportunities and new ways and new proximities in a way. And this is what, through a kind of a field analysis and the kind of indexical process of understanding these kind of patterns of relationships and values, he was then able to introduce these changes and shortcut this kind of system. Or in this project where the student was at the same time studying the kind of urban system here of the city in the Pearl River Delta, Zhuhai, where you have all these nodes of kind of transportation. And then she was studying the Pearl River itself, which is a very tidal river, and the water movement and on this side. And all that in order to create a field of relationships. So the water moves from up here into there, and the people move from here to here. And this becomes a ferry terminal that is also a kind of a tidal water basin. And here you can sort of see, so that the people and the water and the river become sort of intertwined completely. So it's a very poetic, very beautiful project, but it's also based on this kind of way of mapping and indexing these kind of flows and relationships and quantities. So sorry, I'm going to go forward here. So some other kind of examples of these, how the mapping of existing conditions becomes then also the field or the kind of like activity where you can produce or project new possibilities as this kind of loose aggregation, and then kind of create the architecture from there in response to this kind of to what's there, and at the same time to what's possible, and then measure really what makes actually sense. So let it kind of crystallize. And this is this kind of formational process that I was talking about earlier. So this student has been looking at the motorways in Los Angeles and the kind of turning radius that is totally related. So this radius is related to the speed of the vehicle at that given instance. So there's a very kind of mathematical relationships between these kind of circles and the kind of slowing down in order to take another route and so on. And he basically needed to understand these mechanisms to then project this kind of interstitial fabric that then is actually totally intertwined with the motorway, yeah? And it becomes this this linkage, this new radical urban interface. So taking us to what I've been doing with the students in Hong Kong. As you know, Hong Kong is extremely dense and very one of the most urban places in the world. And there's this is actually, again, this project that I was showing earlier, which is a bit of a transitional project that we've done by looking at the Pearl River Delta and at territories and the accumulation of goods and how to strengthen actually agricultural flows against this kind of rapid urbanization that is taking place and this kind of swallowing up everything. So we were looking at how to specifically, sorry, I need to go back, how to look at the kind of systems of relational flows between the production and the kind of further kind of changes, and then to how to bring them to the market and how to create value in a kind of a value chain, and then how to place an architecture that can also hook into that, so it's actually placed in one of those nodes, yeah, where traffic nodes, and at the same time it creates this kind of bridge condition that also helps the local people to cross this kind of, which is at the moment a kind of in the way of the flow. So what you have these kind of spaghetti junctions, and you have these big motorways, and they are being placed somewhere, and then people cannot anymore cross. And sometimes this cuts through an existing village, and people from one side of the village, they're unable to go to the other side. So this device is basically connecting the regional scale with the local scale, and at the same, it's working on the local scale by creating these bridges and by creating these kind of new work opportunities for the local people, and it's living off this kind of larger scale and the kind of interface with the motorway, which you can see here with where these kind of docking stations are for the big trucks and so on, and all that is also related to the way that the geometry of this motorway is being configured, etc. Now this student here has been studying the kind of like natural and artificial light patterns of some of those high-rise buildings in Hong Kong, and also the kind of flow, the densities of these flows, these very vertical flows. And then in order to introduce a kind of a new device, a system of light reflectors that are also ramps that kind of completely reconfigure one of these money-making these money boxes, yeah, where you have a lot of small little hotel rooms around one big central atrium, and it's a very stratified space. So by introducing this kind of new device around the perimeter of the block in the inside, it's actually creating kind of local relationships and continuities, and at the same time bringing light down into the center of the space. So here you can see, so this kind of multiplicity of intentions and is really contingent to an understanding, to a proper mapping process of the found condition and of these different devices like light and reflection, of structure and so on, to kind of like doing this, manipulating them at the same time. Now we're getting into the kind of housing studio that I'm doing since 2 years, and this student was really looking at the kind of different scales of what is currently missing, or what was missing in the modernist housing, is the idea of community. Yeah? So everybody just had their own kind of space, next to each other, but they hardly even met each other because there was no place for them to gather, or for them to kind of get together and for some sense of community to develop. But that is actually happening in these more traditional neighborhoods here, yeah, where you really have this, the pattern enables these kind of interstitial spaces to function as this kind of create these communities. And so he was studying these at different, at very different scales, and then he was proposing them as creating this kind of interstitial conditions, this kind of communal arrangement of units around these courtyards, etc. And actually lifting up what is a Beijing courtyard kind of condition and turning it vertical into this kind of vertical configuration of different cavities and holes. And there's a kind of, again, like this kind of fractal logic here, you can see there's a very big one, and then there's these smaller ones and even smaller ones that are shared with increasingly smaller kind of groups of people, and it becomes more private and more intimate. And they're all intermixed, really, like in this kind of Kustaller diagram. Now, this student did an even more radical project, whereas he used the kind of Le Corbusier, the kind of the unité kind of configuration. He kind of placed several apartments around a corridor, but then he actually runs the corridor across these long blocks rather than in the center of this long block. So it becomes this really strange kind of mixture, scaffold of flow and of different directions. And here you can sort of see this, I hope. Here you can see this wrapping around this kind of center, so that you introduce this kind of flow through the interior of what is usually very private, and you break down these kind of boundaries between inside and outside completely. And this is another student looking at this kind of different scale patterns again for this. So we went to Bangkok last year, and we looked at the superblock and at really this kind of field conditions and patterns, and how to create this kind of sense of sameness, let's say, and at the same time introduce local specificity and local kind of clusters of communities. So here you can sort of see how this student has created a very formal kind of arrangement of these patterns, but then each of these elements has this very differentiated kind of cutting off in the bottom here that then creates another system of transparency here that is not so obvious in plan, but creates different systems that are all intertwined and interrelated to each other. Okay? And here, so you get the red system, which is actually a more commercial principle, and then you get the housing sort of interrelated, and you get certain different degrees of spatial spaces in that sense. And this is like the Asian condition, really. You have to deal with quantity, or you have a completely different awareness, really, about quantity, about repetition, about the sheer scale of this, like this intersection in Bangkok, which is really completely enclosed by this motorway. And it's an area that is currently completely undeveloped. So it's a great opportunity to project like a pattern here that can cross these kind of boundaries and can create its own kind of urban condition in between. And it operates on these multiple levels, really, there, where you have a kind of bike path and the roads and so on, and then the ground is actually kind of relieved from all that kind of purpose. So here, this is the, Emmanuel was asking for the definition of plasma. This is one text that a writer wrote about us. Folding space into space, yeah, I mean, you can read it. Plasma is a kind of a fourth state of matter. That comes from Greek, and it's a scientific term, but it means form in a very basic sense. So this is basically really explaining the way that we are operating in all these different multiple arenas or registers and across them. Like, so our work is really relational, yeah, I would say, that we're knitting across these kind of pragmatic and practical, but then also very theoretical and sculptural kind of registers at the same time. And I think that's really, that is for me, this is a kind of an important point. We're doing this because for me it's not about doing what I feel like doing, but I want to kind of create something that can stand on its own right, yeah, that has its own kind of independency from me and from whoever was involved in the project. So that it really takes on all these different factors, and by doing so, it's giving everybody that experiences it another kind of aspect, because it depends really much more on the focus of the user or of the recipient in that way. Yeah? So if somebody like Peter Eisenman does a project, which I love this work, but then there's many people that can actually not do anything with that because they don't have the kind of knowledge and the kind of intellect to really understand that work. So I'm really much more interested in weaving together something maybe that not everybody gets, but then there's another aspect to it that hopefully, yeah, even small children will get it, yeah, and it's actually more for them than it is for anyone for me. So that it's actually working, the work should be operating also not so cerebral, but actually through physical and bodily experience, first and foremost. So here you can see some of the kind of, I just put this kind of loosely together. So there's definitely a formal repertory that cuts across many different projects. Yeah? And I'm still with my PhD, I'm kind of like looking into that. What is it actually that drives it and why we're doing it, and how to also critically move away from that to some extent as well. So this is a kind of a bit of a stereotomic approach you can see here. Yeah, we're carving solids in a way. We're creating these kind of canyons and very sculptural configurations. But then we're also using the kind of more elemental language to then create more virtual volumes. Yeah, so these are kind of implied volumes, implied kind of relationships and geometries that are not solid anymore, yeah. So we're dematerializing to some in some of these projects. These are really what I was saying before. These kind of the meta message or the meta goals are really about this kind of affective qualities, yeah. That the space should activate and emancipate the user really, so that that you cannot ignore it. You cannot be just passively consume it. But you need to kind of engage with it, and you will need to have to walk around it to understand it, for instance. Yeah, which also relates to the bodily or physical experience. And then at the same time, my interest is to create a kind of a clarity of that people get to understand what the building is doing or what the building is made of, so that there's a kind of an honesty which is not so easy to pin down really. So in a sense, I call this atectonic. So it's not anti-tectonic, it's not tectonic anymore. It's something in between, that where we replace firmness with elasticity, we replace object with field, replace boundary with density, and replace composition with distribution. So you can see all these terms are hinting at this issue of quantity, yeah? And at the kind of a new concept of quantification of information in a way that is not anymore dealing with discrete entities with kind of finite definitions and kind of fixed terms, yeah. But it's actually about topology and different and changes. It's much more concerned with change than it is with facts and fixed. So we started really the practice in London, and we were lucky to do some really small projects. So I think you can obviously, as young becoming architects, that's why I think it would be interesting for you to see just that one can actually start from these very, very small things and actually still do some interesting things. For me, these are still some of the most relevant projects that I've done in my career. So this is one facade that we were given, like a kind of a shop front in London. And you can see how conventional the kind of relationship inside and outside is, yeah? So there's a kind of, and this is basically what we've done with it, yeah? So it's a very radical move, I think, to give away some space, actually, to the public realm, yeah? To move this, to separate the kind of a boundary or the property line from the spatial enclosure, yeah? To create this kind of interstice, yeah? And then actually animate it with this geometry. But what is also kind of, this was a very, very pragmatic, we had a very, very low budget, so we were just using plywood panels for the floor, for instance. So the size that the plywood panels came and the way that they fitted into the existing space, which you see is quite irregular, was actually really driving a lot of the project. So this modulation that got set up in here, yeah, was then, so here you can see these kind of plywood panels, yeah, and everything becomes part of that kind of system of panels here, also the walls and so on. And then we developed that facade to work off against that, but it's also kind of a panelization, yeah, but in a way that this glass is being tilted and shifted. It really creates it creates this kind of multiplicities of reflections, yeah? So it's really a very, very different thing than a flat facade. And that was for me a revelation to understand really how much a little bit of folding and tilting can actually produce. It's really incredible. During the day it's not even that strong, but at night it becomes really like a kaleidoscope of reflections. And it really creates a fantastic space. Unfortunately, this was already taken down, so life in London is very short for space. This is another like small office refurbishment where we really started with this is all different window sections. Yeah? As you can see, we did this kind of a huge number of plexiglass panels for display system, and they're all interrelated geometrically. So you can see the kind of like geometric relationships running across this. So it's not, you can't see very well in these photographs, and then it becomes this kind of shelving system here, and then it turns into the way that the staircase is configured as well. So the steps are all hanging from these sheets of perspex. So this was also structurally and spatially a very challenging project in a way. We did also a lot of installations, experimental installations, where we really kind of tested material conditions. So we were given these really thin steel sheets, and we perforated it with this very simple hexagonal, triangular pattern, yeah. And ironically, by kind of even weakening the material with these, by punching these holes, it became actually much, much stronger. It was turning into a different material condition and was able to create these kind of stress arches across seams, yeah? So the material is only 120 by 240 or so. So what can you do with that? So we were connecting it together, and then we created these kind of global seams that were actually becoming incredibly strong. Here you can sort of see how, and really speculating what kind of different forms you could actually generate from this kind of new material, really, and the kind of reflections and impact and some other kind of aspects that always come as a surprise. Another installation we did here in Chicago, where we were spanning kind of this, we were basically dividing the space. We were notating important points that connect the existing geometry, which is completely orthogonal, to the new geometry that we're creating from this series of lines, yeah, these vectors. So we have 3 different bands or vectors that run through the space, and then each of these vectors, each of these segments was divided through an equal number of points. And then we connected 3 points together, which became these triangles. So it's a very, very simple thing that is a system. Yeah, it's just, we're designing a system. We're not designing anything spatial or aesthetic. It's just a principle, yeah, that kind of unfolds itself and is completely contextual. So if this point wasn't here, it was there, then everything else would be slightly different. Yeah. So in that way, because we weren't able to properly measure the galleries, so we could do this ad hoc when we were there on site. So again, the quality of this installation really derives from the repetition, but also from the differentiation, right? The kind of the gradients that unfold from this kind of mathematical processes that were spatialized through this technique. And I also felt like I dig out some really old competitions here from like 2002, when we were really starting. We were still struggling a bit with kind of renderings and these kind of things. But this is an interesting project in that it really explored the kind of that. You can see this is the German city of Stralsund. This is the ocean, and this is an ocean museum. Yeah. So a competition, and we were developing this building very much from this kind of exterior flows in and around the building, but also as this kind of shaped solid, yeah, which was basically very clearly kind of cut in various places. But then the inside of it was all this kind of supposed to be all this kind of fluidity of spaces. So for an ocean museum, we thought very radically that it should be all these kind of systems of ramps and very fluid. So we had this kind of exterior object, which is very stereotomic, very kind of solid, that had this kind of hole carved in the middle though. And then wrapped inside, we draped it with this kind of series of plateaus, really. So here you can sort of see what that is and the landscape around it and this kind of gap in the, yeah, this is kind of the idea of some Klein bottle condition where you have the inside, the outside actually in the inside, and kind of interesting project, really. Unfortunately, they weren't up for it, so we only got the 5th prize. But yeah, it was then also being developed very much topologically, how these kind of ramps and so on were basically also creating conditions that made this solid legible internally. And another competition that we did in Germany at the time, where we were looking at more like fingers in the landscape and how the buildings were, how like if we were to kind of move them all together, they would create a huge blockage for this site. And we wanted to kind of create this kind of transparency across. So the kind of, to have the buildings internally connected to each other, and then also the landscape around it, we had to weave and stitch them together three-dimensionally, which you can sort of start to see here, yeah? So we were moving them together and then connecting them, and then keep these kind of landscape fingers open and keep the landscape running underneath and through. And this became actually the principle that we are also using later, which I will show in the Xi'an theme pavilion project. And then inside you get these kind of, where these arms connect, you get this kind of thickened indoor, or this kind of branching conditions, or this kind of bundling and branching and very complex spatial conditions, which I thought was, and so here you can see the kind of repetition of very similar, this is also like a kind of a university or so, campus. So there's a lot of repetition of self-similar kind of units, but then the global relationship with the landscape and so on creates this kind of moments where there's kind of a legibility of both, really, and the kind of mutual coexistence and between them. So this was one of the big important projects that really made our name. And here you can see the other architects that were involved. So all the big names were there. Everybody was given one floor of this hotel in Madrid, which was already under construction, and Joan Nouvel did the facade. So we were really honored to be part of that, and but we started very kind of structural, yeah, or kind of conceptual in terms of understanding the organizational system of the building, which was existing as this repetitive pattern of rooms, yeah. And then we transformed these rooms or these kind of walls into a system of formational forces that acted onto this kind of formally very generic corridor, yeah. So in every hotel, be it 5-star or 2-star, you always have this boring corridor that is always the same, yeah? It's this kind of anodyne experience. You just want to cross through it real quick to get to your room. So we wanted to create that, translate that into like a experience, into a journey. So we did that by the kind of deformation, and we also did that by the kind of color gradient that was applied through light seams into the gaps between these panels. And the seamlessness of the material as well, which is done with stainless steel. So here you can see the principle. All the frames have the same amount of points, and this is the maximum and the minimum that we could work with in terms of the corridor size. So within those parameters, we did this kind of configuration, and then the room became the kind of extension of that to some extent. And it's a very powerful experience, definitely. It works really well to kind of create this space that is completely decontextualized. It has no daylight, yeah. It's got this kind of, and then it's perfect for this kind of approach for a 5-star hotel where every floor is completely different. And we wanted to break out a little bit this architectural shopping experience where people go there and then, oh, this must be Foster, oh, this must be Zaha, and so on. And because we were unknown, we were obviously able to escape that for a little while. But we were also a little bit violent or almost brutal, yeah? Which I thought, so this is really in your face. You come out of the lift here and you see this kind of big thing sticking out and don't really know what that is, really. It doesn't have any function. When you come in, you don't understand it. When you go around, it becomes this kind of pocket, yeah, where you can actually sit down. It's like a cocoon. You can wait for the lift and inside of there. But when you come out of the lift, you don't really understand anything. So we wanted to create this kind of almost catharsis of like freeing people up when they come in and they get this kind of shock, and then they can actually start understanding the principles and the system behind it all. So after that, we didn't do any more of these kind of weird hotel projects, but we started working in, not far from here, yeah, in the Italian Alps, in South Tyrol, which was really, really quite a nice change. So here you can see the context and the mountains that are really, really important to this area and the kind of local vernacular that we had to kind of somewhat find a way of dealing with, yeah. So we did that through the materiality, first and foremost, but not through the form. So the form is more an index of the mountainscapes and of the organization of the experience of these. When you walk there and so on, you obviously engage with the ground in a completely different way than you are on a flat land, yeah. So we introduced then this kind of landscape through these kind of systems of frames that enabled us to create this very kind of soft, sculpted volumes and spatial kind of continuities, really, through something that is actually kind of rigid at the same time, yeah. So here you can see it starts actually with the staircase, yeah. So the modulation of that exterior staircase that then becomes an interior staircase, and the terrace sets up this kind of 30-centimeter frames. So it's a very kind of logical, very extremely coherent kind of system. Here you can sort of see it, and this is basically the principle, yeah? So we have these kind of frames, vertical frames that bind everything together. Also connecting the old and the new, because this is actually a kind of a parasite of a building that sits on top of the existing building. So it's for the client that, and there's no more sites in the village, so the father gives him the roof of his own building. So basically there's a kind of a cross-family relationship, but then they also wanted the independence. So this had to be completely separate from what's underneath. And yeah, here you can sort of see underneath, it's also like a kind of a bit of an acquired taste. And this is the new edition. And here you can see the kind of relationship that goes, these frames that also kind of become then, go through the architecture in this kind of tectonic way. And the terrace then expands onto the roofscape and gives this opportunity to really climb and to experience the kind of view around and see the mountains all around. So it's really this kind of expansion of the perspective, and also giving these different qualities. Yeah, so you have here some more sheltered kind of condition, and here's much more open, and you create this kind of interstitial kind of relationships and gaps in between them. So then the next project, and we did the kind of horizontal slicing, yeah, and that is because this is a very kind of topographical site, and then the way that the site was being organized by the as a convention, this kind of topography lines became really the language that became then the skin of the building. So it's, and that worked actually quite well in its own right. So again, we have this, what we did in here, it's like, unlike Puerto America, where the one skin, that metal skin, was basically doing everything, and also so it's a functional aspect. So it's got doors, yeah, it's got lighting, it's got services, and that was extremely difficult to achieve. In here, this is a building that has a regular budget that wasn't like hugely expensive. We could only spend the kind of average amount. So we really separated the performative skin from the expressive skin, let's say, or we separated what does the kind of climatic distinction from the other kind of layer that is the balcony. Yeah? So, and then we created these two skins and this kind of gap in between. And what was very important is to create a translation between what is actually quite a relatively complex geometry and something that is actually a very regular kind of geometry. So these kind of Steher, these kind of elements, metal elements, were all done with an algorithm in order to translate that kind of angle precisely that is given by a computer program, so that all these wooden elements just had to be mounted, and nobody had to take any measurement on site. Otherwise, it would have been impossible. So yeah, but this interstitial space really works quite nicely in terms of the expanding the interior into the outside for certain conditions. So it's creating really this multiplicity of different uses and shading, and it's also animating the building in a very rich and diverse way at different times. And here you can see the kind of relationships between inside and outside, how that is carried through. And this is the third project where we use these sticks, and this time it's a bit more freer. It's kind of like a whirlwind, like a vortex, curling around the building. So it's really taking some liberties here. It's basically really articulating the flow of the building into the landscape and the engagement with it. Yeah. And here you can, I take this again back a little bit into the kind of the tectonics of quantity, yeah, where you have a lot of different elements, but that's not a problem nowadays. Yeah, they can all be done differently. Doesn't really matter if they're all the same or they're all different. It kind of costs the same. So that's an opportunity really for you guys as well, that you can embrace or not. And I just want to show this project very briefly, because it's kind of bringing things a little bit back into the more stereotomic that we were kind of concerned with at an earlier stage. So it's not using this kind of open patterns and the repetition of these elements so much, but it's actually creating a much more enclosed or surface architecture and this kind of almost volumetric kind of expression of this gap within the building. And then it's also introducing the distinction between the material that gets a lot of weathering, a lot of rain, and then the kind of areas that are more sheltered and protected, they are actually used with these woods. So you get almost the inside spilling into the outside and really cutting down on this kind of boundary, which is a big concern for architecture as well, to how to break down this kind of conventions norms and boundaries, like the boundary between inside and outside or between public and private. How can you actually kind of create a bit more of an ambiguity between these conditions, let's say. And these overhanging rooms, which are quite domestic because of the wood, are actually doing this quite well. And then the way that it sits in the hillside. And now I want to be, I'm showing you some moment of crisis. This has really been a big drama. One of our first projects in China, in Mongolia, which ultimately was this city in Orders, which was basically never happened. It's one of these ghost cities. There was a lot of famous architects involved in Orders on different projects. So we wanted to engage really with the landscape. That was fantastic. We were there and so on. And the climatic condition is interesting. So we created these really very abstract kind of systems of flows, of patterns through the landscape. And that became then the kind of organizational principle for the building as well. Yeah? So you have this building, which is actually more, there's 5 of them. They're actually these kind of cubes. But then you have this kind of internal facade, the kind of void in the middle, where the landscape kind of creeps up, and then it comes up, and then it flows down and forms the facade. So that was the principle, very beautiful. But then we went through all kinds of weird, I would say, wanking almost exercises that didn't go anywhere, yeah. And we even had like one of our employees that went a little bit. He had a burnout syndrome also, because the whole thing was just completely out of control. But I guess we had to do it. We had to go through this to understand that this is not the way, really. So you can see this is, yeah. What is this even? Yeah. So then I felt we needed to bring in some sort of directionality or some principles, and this is what's, it's working actually, great. So you can see the landscape becomes actually the internal tree that holds this. No, it's not working again. Let's see if it's doing it one more. Yeah. So it comes up and then it forms this kind of space frames that brings out, and then the whole facade is hanging from it. So because there's a kind of direction of the structures that is very directional, that gives an order to the whole thing that really, really helps to form this into something much more coherent. And so in that sense, then that introduces also that the facade pattern needs to hold a lot more on the top and increasingly less in the bottom, because there's less floors to be supported, so it can actually thin out. So there's a logic that drives everything, this from the structure to the aesthetics of the building. And I think it became then quite nice. Unfortunately, it was never built, but maybe one day, some other place. So, Izmir University of Economics. How are we with time? Is it okay? Okay, yeah, we'll be. So this is a master plan that we've been just completed more or less in a very kind of very hilly area near the Mediterranean Sea, and it's a vast territory, and they wanted to have a lot of buildings on it. So it's very topographical. So we started to really map these hillsides, these topographies as this kind of meshes that then produce different options for occupation. And this is kind of the leitmotif, let's say, the marble core is coming back again, and how the buildings then really become these kind of terraces, yeah, within. So they are highly contingent to the topography in order to kind of make this whole thing feasible, in order to kind of bring people there and also kind of limit the amount of earth removal. So it's this kind of terrace building, and then how to create the kind of relationships between inside and outside spaces, between volume and landscape in a way that is repetitive but not monotonous. And at the same time, there's a kind of clear hierarchy of like a central spine from where you get these kind of arms going across. So it's very important, I think, that something like this can actually be experienced and not be confusing. So here you get this kind of interrelationships really between the new geometry and the existing geometry of the hillside being in this kind of symbiotic state. And this is so far, Emmanuel was talking about it a little bit, this is the kind of Xi'an Expo project that we have completed in 2011, so it's already an old project in a way. At the same time, still actual, because the Chinese, they're coming back with kind of doing this kind of access now. Yeah. So this was basically the master plan. This is what they actually had in mind. Some sort of parking here, then you go over and you go along this long axis. You have some other thing here, yeah, and then you have this kind of more natural kind of nature mimicry in here, like an English garden or so. Now, what we've done is obviously we complied with this kind of with the same pattern to some extent, yeah, but we actually made it a lot more loose or gradient and much more indeterminate, yeah. So in here it's obviously everybody wants to go over this bridge to go to the actual area. So everybody was brought together and naturally guided to this condition, and in here you actually don't even feel you're on the bridge, yeah? It feels like you're just on the ground. And then after you pass the bridge, it kind of branches out again, yeah? It kind of loosens this kind of tightness, and it gives all this, but then at the same time you have a lot more tendency to go straight, yeah? So if you're lazy or you're really not in the mood of venturing out and exploring, then you will just go straight and go here to the main building. Meanwhile, those that are more adventurous, they can choose other paths and always find a way to come back, yeah, to the main spine. So this is what I was saying before, yeah, it's a kind of indeterminate axis. So these are the questions that I was asking myself, yeah, how can there be indeterminism from specificity, and how to combine causality with freedom of choice. I think this is an attempt to kind of try this, to give people an indication, yeah, a clear indication of where to go, but at the same time also the choice of not to go there, which is not anymore possible to do such things in China, I think, unfortunately. And it's got this kind of multiple hierarchies again of different paths that are some are almost for maintenance, but everybody is welcome to use them as well as shortcuts and to be closer to the plants, etc. This is this kind of main bridge, yeah, which became a bit of an icon that was meant to be overgrown by plants, and I think it's still not because they don't plant them, which is a shame. Could be really fantastic as a green tunnel. And here, this was a bit of a trick. This is always an interesting one I like to show, because if we have these different directions, yeah, coming from this kind of axis. If you just go back quickly, yeah. So we have these all these different directions, yeah, of whoops here, and patterns coming from all that. So it's nothing is aligned, and then how to do that materially if you work with kind of orthogonal material patterns, yeah. So we stopped them short and we created this kind of interstitial wedge in between them, really. That was a very cheap but also quite interesting for the experience of the people, right? And it really brings out this kind of discrepancies in a much more powerful way than if you would try to fudge it in some way, which would never work. So you can also see this. And this is the main building that we have designed, which from when you arrive from the axis or from that kind of indeterminate axis, it totally camouflages as some landscape. Yeah, it doesn't really read as a building at all. That was also us having some fun with the kind of expectations of these kinds of events. So when you go around it and you see it from the back as this very iconic object, yeah. But so it's actually doing a kind of Palladio in reverse. Yeah, you go to the back, and that's actually the architecture, and from the front it's almost invisible. So this is again the view from the back, yeah, And here you can see how the building is completely subordinated to the landscape. Whilst in the middle, and inside, it's actually extremely, yeah, how do you say, Cartesian or kind of logically organized. And there isn't a simple way of creating one continuous flow through it. It was actually a bit impossible for us to make that work. So I was looking at Leonhard Euler and the Königsberg bridge problem, which is a very mathematical, the beginning of graph theory. And through this kind of technique or principles, I was understanding that this building cannot be organized because it has these different spaces, yeah? So as a diagram. And so it cannot be really organized in a linear fashion. And I was getting a bit frustrated about that, but then at some point I thought like, wow, that's actually a real quality. So what's happening now is you have to decide. You can either go down here again, or you have to go straight, and you always miss something and you have to go back and you have to do something double. So it's not anymore what the Chinese wanted was this kind of really linear loop where everybody was doing the same thing. And we were basically giving them something where that was just not possible, yeah? And I thought, brilliant, actually. At first I thought, no, we did something really stupid. And then I thought, no, this is actually not stupid at all, yeah. So, and you see that for me, it's like form is always like, you see, I just did this after I did the diagram, I did it really simplified, yeah? It's not actually the shape of the building. And then I just cladded it with it, and it's almost looking like the building, yeah? So there is actually a kind of a causality here, and the form itself is just a medium really to kind of to express somehow this kind of internal organization through the kind of, but at the same time also kind of expand from it to some extent. And yeah, what is really important is these kind of interstitial conditions, yeah, like the arms of landscape that go underneath the building. So the people in the building go above here, and then it's this kind of intertwining of inside and outside that is really, for me, the most important thing. So these spatial conditions and the kind of local usages, the kind of informal gatherings that were happening here, and they're happening here because it's not the front of the building. This is actually the back, yeah, where you have the lake, you have a breeze, but you also have this kind of covered space. But what is really important in China and elsewhere also, that if this was in the front, everybody would chase them away, yeah. But so we moved this, the more important, the more expressive area of the building, we moved it to the back, and we enabled these kind of patterns to be and people to enjoy themselves in these spaces. So yeah, that brings us to the end of this talk. Thank you for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to hear some questions. Thank you.
So we'll take questions from the students.
Sure.
So thank you very much, Holger. Do you have questions, comments?
What was actually the criteria for that unstructural structure you did, for example, for this building?
Unstructured structure?
It's not symmetrical, it's just, it has its structure, but what was the criteria behind it?
Yeah, it's actually quite complicated and complex. It started really with, if we could just go back here, let's see if we can shortcut this a little bit, or maybe. It started actually with this diagram that I was showing at the very beginning, which was for another project. Oh, this will be like really long, no? So it started, we were basically just, we didn't have much time for the competition, so we worked a lot on the landscape, and then we had to do some sort of building, and then it was really like something that was not related to. We also didn't have much information about the context. The context was also constantly changing, yeah? The lake and so on. So we did something that was very diagrammatic, which was this kind of like fingers, let's say. So, and then they really didn't want us to change it. So we were like, okay, now we won the competition, let's do a building that really makes sense in that place. And then they were like, no, but it has to look like this, yeah. So we were a little bit thinking, okay, how can we keep this, but then at the same time make sense out of it? And then it started with this kind of, there is a kind of a symmetry there, yeah. So the three arms, it's like a really strange vehicle, yeah. It is kind of symmetrical. Then at the same time, it is also the beginning of a repetition, right? So it's not, if you just have two is not really a pattern, yeah? Three is sort of beginning, but not really, right? So it's that kind of ambiguity that I really try to engage with the kind of loops that go through the inside, yeah? So the different, so the circulation system in the inside is really, really driven by that threeness, let's say, yeah. So that you have these are lowest, these are a bit higher up, and then here you go up, and then so it creates this kind of loops, yeah. And then here you have this view always. You have these kind of windows, yeah, which is almost like to look and to be seen, and kind of playing with this kind of iconicity, like kind of taking that as a kind of almost reflecting it back on itself, really. So that was, in a sense, the driving force. And then this kind of, I think, the big cantilever over the water, that was a big effort, yeah, structurally and so on. And that was definitely to make that kind of, yeah, to create that interstitial condition down there, and at the same time create some sort of tension and some sort of dynamic of this kind of long approach of the landscape, and then the building really had to do something quite spectacular to kind of make this kind of endpoint, I would say.
Yeah. Do you mind?
Yeah, I was just curious, do I need it or so you can hear?
Can you hear in the back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Curious about your affirmation about China. When you said it was possible before to make seem that we're offering freedom of choice, and it's not possible right now. So what changed in the meantime?
Yeah, they have a new president, in Xi Jinping, who is completely different from the one before. And they're a very autocratic, very homogeneous society, and the one on the top basically determines everything. It's that simple. So when they had Mao, then Mao was just coming up with a great leap forward, and there was 40 million people dead and so on. So one person can cause a lot of havoc in there. And this guy, I mean, there is maybe also like a necessary correction that they were basically, yeah, maybe too much pushing for this kind of iconic architecture to some extent. So there has to be some sort of reflection on that. But now in China, they always go from one extreme to the next. So that, like, they do one thing bad, and then they're not just coming back a little bit, they're going like all the way to the other direction. So right now they're just building replicas of temples, and museums become like some sort of retrograde kind of things. Like that last slide, actually, they came up with that really later, yeah? That pagoda, that wasn't actually there from the beginning. At some point they felt like, okay, we need something of that kind, yeah? And now everything is of that kind somehow. That's why I quite like this kind of relationship, because it's a little bit, it's actually, it looks like that's the future and that's the past, but in fact it's the other way around. Yeah, I think it really goes through the techniques or the processes of like the indexical drawings that we're doing when we're dealing with a large-scale project like this one, then we're really working through a kind of a, yeah, I wouldn't say materialization, but a kind of a diagramming of translating certain kind of conditions into possibilities for form, yeah? So that the form is then based on these kind of determining factors. So you need to always somehow, you can do that also intellectually, yeah? But we're doing that very much through form, really. For instance,
But the methods behind it,
yeah.
not only the shape of the building, but the process, how you do architecture, has that been transformed through the information?
Totally. Yeah, I think I would say it's a combination, right? So you obviously you always have some sort of basic idea, let's say in one of those buildings in South Tyrol, you have this idea of like slicing something horizontally, but then after that you also create some sort of system of relationships that you want to connect to, yeah? So that you want, there is a kind of like a topographical condition that gives you certain choices for how to connect the kind of skin of the building with the ground, for instance. And so you need to, so in that sense, the building is then really indexical to that ground, yeah? So it's not anymore just willful, or it's something that is actually driven by, which is actually algorithmic process, yeah? And it's actually about kind of quantities, it's about the kind of principles of what you find, right? And the same thing will also go for any other kind of parameter that, I mean, I'm not claiming that we're doing this kind of parametric architecture that kind of does itself and everything is driven by algorithm. You can do that if you do a sports stadium, yeah? Then a lot of things will be driven by these numbers, and it will be very extremely logical, and because like 5 centimeter of difference makes, if you have 20,000 seats, makes a big thing, right? And it's all about sight lines, it's all about mathematics, really, yeah? And in our case, it's not like that, but there's some elements of that, and I like to think that there's enough of it in order to make it not look willful, let's say. What I find really difficult for myself and for architecture is the kind of arbitrariness and willfulness, yeah? So that the building should overcome by synthesizing other things that are, that's actually the beauty of architecture, that it's got automatically a lot more layers than like a piece of art or so. In a sense, it brings in like function and the context and technical aspects and economy and all these things, yeah? And if that becomes legible, which it not always does, right? If some of that becomes legible, it's much more rich than if it's not, right?
I like really much this building in Mongolia. It was really awesome. And my question would be, what do you think, which role, which place should nature, plants, ecosystems have in architecture and in urban areas, and why these crystalline forms?
Sorry, what was the thing with the ecosystem?
What role should the nature, plants and ecosystems play in urban architecture?
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, we should also be, I should probably talk a little bit more about the kind of environment and the kind of relationship and so on about that. But for me, it's really about breaking down, like not just breaking down boundaries like really locally, but also creating a kind of an urbanism that is really integral, right? Where you don't have that distinction between what is green and what is not, and you create that kind of possibility for coexistence at the same time. And in that sense, the crystalline forms are a little bit also about that negotiation, yeah. So that it is not as a metaphor so much, but actually as a kind of this kind of translation that you have found. Like you go into you buy yourself some materials and they come either like in sticks or they come in sheets, yeah. Currently, yeah, and that maybe will be changing at some point, but not in the foreseeable future. So I wouldn't probably, yeah, if there's really a reason for doing a very curvy linear building, I still have to find it, because at the moment I feel that is really super applied, yeah. It's kind of like, yeah, what I was saying earlier is very willful. It's not an index of the kind of material conditions of the kind of material reality that we're living in, yeah. And so in that sense, if we're building the buildings in a kind of more faceted way, but that enables us to reflect kind of like the standard kind of procedures of building technology. At the same time, it gives us more freedom than what orthogonal patterns give us, right? Where you have very deterministic relationship between floor, wall, and ceiling, and like you've seen in some of the projects, where those boundaries kind of are becoming dissolved. Yeah. So the folded crystalline forms are kind of that kind of possibility where you get fluidity, but you're still carrying on some continuity also continuity of context, right? So it's much easier to align with something that exists than if you put the Peter Cook Kunsthaus or so in Graz. It's kind of cool, but it's like a one-off, right? Because it's really the friendly alien. It's completely alien, yeah, to what's around it. So a building that I would project there would probably fit in more and would maybe be not so interesting. But that's for others to judge.
But that's not really true. Your buildings are aliens as well, or aren't they? Just a bit more like the topography going into the building, but the rest is.
That's what the neighbors think.
Yeah,
Maybe it's a local thing, really, because I think they fit in really rather well.
We had one more question in the back. Yeah.
Well, we have kind of a few set of questions that we ask our guests. Well, the first will be, if you wouldn't have to set the table for future generations of architects, with what would you dish it up?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I would say probably I would put food in there, really. So, because but really, without joke, I think to be able to create a meal and to kind of engage the senses and to be really creative about that and really knowledgeable, yeah. That's basically also what we're trying to do. It's like cooking a really, really good dish, yeah, that is nourishing, but it's also kind of expanding the mindset of like what you have experienced before, yeah. So once in a while you do that. Most of the times you don't, right? No, which is the same with a built environment. Most of the times you just want to have something that works, yeah. But sometimes you want to have that really special moment, yeah. And that can, I think, food is a very, very good comparison for that, like an analog, for the way you have to put together certain components in order to create something that is extremely exhilarating, yeah, and fantastic, maybe even more than architecture. Who knows? No, not really.
Because you touched upon the subject of housing and how these days the function of community is missing when it comes to housing. What would you suggest that we as young architects could or even should do when it comes to that?
I think firstly it's, but I think you guys are probably much better in that, is to really understand housing. it's such a complicated issue, and it probably takes a few years to really get your head around it properly, yeah? To kind of to be able to then really play with it, let's say, and explore, because whatever you do will affect something else, right? So if you have, maybe you have a brilliant idea, but then somehow the person next to it is disadvantaged, then for me that's already a big no. For me it's really like it has to be working for all, or it doesn't work, yeah? So that, I think that's also important, that we start sort of thinking again about these kind of equal qualities, rather than thinking in everything being stratified and all about like how much can you afford and let's have these different qualities, and if that guy doesn't get the light then he has to pay less and that's okay. I don't think so. So if you then have to do everything kind of to a certain standard, and of course they can have different sizes because there's different, we are in a very pluralist society, so that makes it also extremely complicated at the same time, but also extremely rewarding if one manages. But then, yeah, one needs to look at how to not kind of fall back into this kind of monotony of like the mindless repetition again, right? So how to create kind of a certain kind of differentiation and legibility of these kind of spatial relationships and maybe even ruptures but at the same time not sacrifice individuals' kind of quality, right? Which, like somebody like Hundertwasser, obviously, it's an example that is very superficial in that sense. Yeah, so we need to, but it isn't easy, right, to do that. So and it's so polemic. The whole issue of housing is so contested, and it's also kind of constantly changing. That it's probably the most difficult and ambitious area for architecture.
Okay, we take one more, and then I have one, and then we need to close up. Please.
How would you say the society or social standards in different countries influence your building?
Yeah, I haven't built in so many countries. So, and some of these things, they are kind of quite universal. So the university campus in Izmir, for instance, I mean, it hasn't really been driven by any kind of local differences or so. Like, they don't really have this kind of issues that you would have in an Arab country. In an Arab country, you would have to segregate completely male and female students and so on. So that would really kind of influence the architecture a lot, right? Then in China, the buildings that we've done so far, I mean, they are really driven by a much more kind of macroeconomic problem that they have to grow so fast, and they have to kind of supply so much new buildings and volumes and so on, that everything has to be done on this kind of much bigger scale, where there's so that scale is very, in a strange way, locally specific, but also extremely generic. Yeah. So, but when you look at buildings in China by different architects, they will look like that architect, but they will also look like they're in China. So there's some sort of strange amalgam that develops, which isn't really what you want to hear, probably. It's really not the idea of like being locally specific and being responsible. Although I really want to be, but I'm also in that sense a little bit jaded about certain kind of like possibilities that we have as architects, because we're not anymore involved in making the brief in many places. It's very unfortunate, and when it comes to social arrangement, also I have to say our clients in South Tyrol, they have been quite open-minded, and when it comes to balconies and kind of wooden sticks, they kind of like it and so on. But when it comes to their own kind of internal spaces, they have been far less adventurous. You know, we were proposing some really much more interesting configurations for rooms and spatial relationships, open, etc. And usually it becomes this kind of boxed-in shapes. That's something I have to say. It's not an easy way to get around. You just have to find the right clients, maybe.
So what I found very, very interesting in your work is that you, in a way, combine. You don't combine, but you exclude maximas and then you work within. You say you don't like arbitrariness, but neither do you like willfulness. But then it's always a mixture in between. Or you like sculpture, but then you're interested in fields because they're almost exclusing each other. So all these kinds of, they're not contradictions, but they're consciously created tensions, and then to work on a huge spectrum always in between. So the one question that I'm not sure whether it's a fair question or whether you can actually give an answer to it, but you said at one point that it's very important for you that the work has a kind of an autonomy and maintains a kind of an autonomy. So how do you recognize that? Or how can you, or when is this achieved, or how can you talk about that? It's a hard one, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I shouldn't be the judge of that. So when I heard quite a lot of different kinds of people going to the Hotel Puerto America and experiencing that floor, and then some people thought like, oh my God, I'm gonna have nightmares, but I didn't. And some other people, it's like, oh, people would get nightmares, which I've never thought about. Like, why would people get nightmares because of all these sharp corners? But maybe there is something about that I wasn't aware of that actually does exist, kind of psychology of space or whatever. So, but so there's a lot of things that are completely out of control to some. But then when you get feedback, and I got a lot of very positive feedback. So I think there is a role for architecture to become a bit more adventurous, to kind of like take people on a journey and kind of give them something that is new to them, really. And in that sense, I think if that happens, it's already achieved in some ways. So, but that doesn't mean that you can just do any crazy thing, right? Because that's just kind of wearing off at some point. And I think also the building stood the test of time. Yeah, when I look at a lot of these buildings, this is already from 2005, and a lot of that stuff looks also incredibly dated in a way. So it's another assessment. Is like a little bit like looking beyond the kind of like immediate moment and see how the thing weathers down, and that it doesn't become, if it does become a little bit like, okay, that was 2005 or so, that would be a problem, I think, in a way, and it doesn't. But so that's fortunate, let's say. But there might be some other projects that, fortunately, also some of the projects, they have been transformed and worked on, and that's also interesting when there's the project itself becomes actually a living organism, and it sort of mutates and is able to transform. I think it's very important that is possible, I think, and that is another level of autonomy, I think, that I would really try to involve always as well.
When you, what would you say are the most important phenomena for today, for the let's say something like our condition today, to be attentive to, like development? So you've spoken a lot about Asia and these different scales, and then the different kind of local sensibilities and how to even relate, because we are aliens as well when we go there to work to a certain degree. So what would be the themes to think about and to be attentive to for young architecture students? A few recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, personally, we were just talking, me and my colleague Peter, about that 10 years ago or so, it was much more obvious what the avant-garde was and where things were going at the time, which was kind of digital, parametric, these kind of things. And now it's actually, there's a huge backlash against that. So it's actually relatively difficult to define a position, or like where things, and I find it intriguingly also more complicated, yeah, with the kind of like increasing digitalization of lifestyles and virtualization and all these things. So everything becomes more diffuse first and foremost, and for me that sets up a little bit of a questioning of these kind of motifs or patterns or not the intentions behind. Yeah, I think the intentions behind, I really want to kind of translate them, but I don't want to be always looking at differentiation for differentiation's sake. So that's where what I was showing a little bit with the work that I was doing with the students in Hong Kong is really also looking at like, okay, what is the value of sameness, yeah, or what, and where this kind of field condition comes in. So I think we need to identify that people need a little bit of, they need excitement, they need kind of complexity, they need to be engaged and enriched, and at the same time they need some sort of calm and quiet and kind of some sort of safety, and how as an architect to somehow negotiate those two. I think that's probably becoming increasingly important, because at the moment we're in this condition where you have this kind of star architects that each of them has their different brands, and everything becomes then really like who's choosing, right? Then you get a certain person and that chooses a certain architect, and then it sets up a certain kind of direction for like, let's say, okay, we want something really calm, we want something really kind of idealist or timeless or something where we get Chipperfield, and that's for this project, yeah. And then in another case, you get another kind of person choosing and goes for Zaha and wants something really dynamic and super exciting, right? And we have to claim back somehow as architects the kind of authority of like making those decisions rather than giving them away and being this kind of products out there, or this that are in the supermarket for people to pick and choose, I think. And how to do that, it's not an easy one.
But that's a good, I say it's up to them.
Yeah, but try to think about that a bit, and don't just kind of create your brand or something. I think I'm too much of a brand already. I really want to get out of it.
So if you come next time, we will ask you not so much about the quantity, but the precious.
Very good.
Okay. Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
here.
Thanks very much.